Yeah, so on today's show, I'm going to be talking about the history of two handed guitar tapping. And like most guitar techniques, um, the origins are, are much hidden. And it's not really clear who invented tapping. Of course, Ed Van Halen was the guy that popularized it. And before him, there weren't that many guys who did tapping. It was not a household guitar technique. So, as for the origins of tapping, who invented it? Well, um, I guess it goes back to one of the first guys, and I'd say one of the first guys, not necessarily the first. I mean, who knows who the first one was? But one of the first was a guy named Paganini, who is was one of the virtuosos of the violin. He lived during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and of course he was famous for being a violin wizard, but he was also one of the first guys to tap. Now there may have been guys that have tapped before him, and I mean it's unsure if tapping was even invented on guitar. I mean it may have been invented on the violin or the cello or some other fretted stringed instrument, and so it's hard to know for certain. But Paganini, who may not be the first, but he was one of the first, probably, or maybe not one of the first. Maybe it's been around since antiquity, but but the earliest I could find was Paganini, and he tapped on violin, and he had some of his other innovations like pizzicato, and I'm not that familiar with the violin and its techniques, but he also played guitar, from what I understand, and the lute, which is like a fretted stringed guitar-like instrument. And he also I mean he tapped on the violin. Um, you know, in performances, and there were critics and fans that wrote about it, that described that he used his pick finger, or I guess his bow finger, tapping the frets, of the or the fretboard of the violin. Now, did he tap on guitar or the lute? I don't know. I guess it's unknown, but he may have. He probably did. I mean, if he thought about tapping on the violin, he probably did tap on the guitar as well. Although from what I understand, he didn't play the guitar or the lute publicly, or he may have, but he was not really that known for it. It was to him it was more in a recreational capacity, and so he tapped on violin, and so from Roy Smack or from Paganini, we go to another guy named Roy Smeck, who was a vaudeville jazz entertainer from the 1920s, 1930s, and he played ukulele, and he was a ukulele virtuoso. And he also did play guitar. He was a jazz guitarist. He was, a shredder. He was fleet fingered jazz guitarist, and he also played. the banjo. Now I don't know if he tapped on guitar or banjo, but he tapped on, I guess his main instrument was the ukulele. And there's footage of him. There's video of him playing the ukulele. It was in a movie. I think the movie was called Summer House Blues or Clubhouse Blues, something blues, Clubhouse Blues or something like that, circa 1929 or thereabouts. And it was one of the first movies that had featured sound, because in the 20s, most or all movies were silent films. But in this one, he plays the ukulele, and he's shredding on ukulele. I mean, he's very charismatic ukulele player, and he shredded on it, and made it look really cool. He was a virtuoso on that instrument, and he tapped. Now, the tapping that he did was, he played like a chord, or I guess 2 or 3 note chord. I think there's only 4 strings on a ukulele. But he would play like a little chord, and then he would tap and let go and let it ring, and then tap the other note and let that ring. So it sounded kind of like an arpeggio that would be played like with a folk guitar, where when you play an arpeggio in the folk style guitar finger pick, it rings out. I guess he kind of did that on the ukulele. Now I don't know if he tapped on guitar. I've seen footage of him playing guitar and banjo, but he didn't tap on it. Now he may have tapped. If he tapped on banjo, I mean, the banjo's a very shreddy instrument. It's essentially, looks to me like a snare drum for a body. So I mean, the notes just cut off; they don't ring. So you can get that really short, where the notes are really short and clean, and you can really shred on it, I guess, if you are skilled at it, right? And he was skilled at it. Now I don't know if he tapped or not on the banjo or on the guitar, but he tapped on the ukulele. This was circa 1929 or so. Now, in the 100 or so years between Paganini and Roy SMECK, from about circa 1800 to about the 1920s, 1930s, did anybody tap? In between time, I would find it hard to believe that no one tapped. I mean, no one, in all that 100+ years, no one thought of taking their pick finger or their bow finger, a bow hand, and putting it on the fretboard. And there may have been celloists, violinists, other violinists, other people that played guitar, instruments that were either guitar or guitar-like instruments, that probably tapped. Some of these composers, I mean, this being a 19th century, classical composers, some of them were probably famous, just not famous for tapping. So, from there, we go to Harry DeArmond. DeArmond is a familiar name because of DeArmond pickups. And, he was an inventor and a builder of pickups. And when he tested the pickups on the assembly line, he didn't pick up the guitar, from what I understand. He just, he tapped the notes to test this, and then he created a musical style out of that. And he had a protege named Jimmy Webster, who we're going to the next guy who tapped, Jimmy Webster. I guess it was a student of his. He was a musician, and he also was, I guess he worked at the factory run by DeArmond. And I've heard some music from Jimmy Webster. His style of tapping, I mean, it was different. It was not this stuff. It wasn't just doing that. It sounded like two guitars at the same time simultaneously. It sounded like he would be playing rhythm or bass lines with one hand, and then the melody or maybe the lead or something else with the other hand at the same time. That's what it sounded like. There was no video. It was just completely audio. And so that, that was it. It was just audio. But another thing that sounded interesting was what he did was it sounded like he was tapping or doing tap harmonics. Now, I remember watching a video of a guitar instructor named Kurt Mitchell who claimed that Ed Van Halen invented tapped harmonics, or at least that was the first time he probably heard it. And maybe in the world of rock, Van Halen was the first, but who knows? I mean, what this guy did, this was circa 1940s, 1950s, right? And Jimmy Webster sounded like he was doing tapped harmonics. And he probably was not the first to do that, neither. I mean, who knows who was the first to do that, but he was doing it in 1940s. And so, you got, those first four guys, that were, at least four guys, that were tapping from, the late 18th century, including Paganini, all the way to the early 20th century. And there were guys that were tapping. So who invented tapping? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think they were definitely tapping pioneers. There was different ways of tapping, right? It's not just this stuff, which I think is everyone's familiar with. I mean, there's 8-fingered tapping, there's piano tapping, there's tapping that doesn't sound like tapping. It's like, you could do some string skipping licks that sound like sweep picking, but it's not sweep picking. You probably play sweep picking licks, that don't sound like sweep picking, though, if you play them at a different speed. If you play, probably different tunings or something, it won't sound, the way that one expects it to sound. So tapping can sound like a lot of different things. So, I'll do more research on the subject. I'm sure there were a lot of other guys that were tapping pioneers and that never really got the credit. We're not famous. Some of them were famous musicians. Of course, Paganini was a very famous guy, but he wasn't really that famous for tapping. And some of these other guys were famous, but not for tapping. And so they may have tapped, and they may have created other techniques that have been lost, that they didn't get credit for, or people may have rediscovered in recent years. But stay tuned for more videos of this sort. I'm going to be doing more research on the subject and hopefully come up with more names of tappers.